Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday's Other Scriptures for October 13th. I'm preaching the second in a series of sermons on the surprising plans God has for us. And this morning it's going to be on God's plan for wealth. And that is surprising in a number of ways, only because it's so different from what we have come to accept. And when I say we, I don't just mean contemporary Americans. I mean that the Pharisees also believed that if you were blessed with lots of wealth, then you must be doing all right as far as God is concerned, because he gives wealth to the righteous. And if you're not doing well, if you're not wealthy or healthy, then you must really have offended God. And what's surprising is this is absolutely not true. The Bible does not teach karma, quite the opposite. What the Bible does teach is that wealth is the responsibility of certain people to care for other people, that it's not given to us for our own benefit. And so it really follows from last week's sermon about marriage, which really emphasized that we marry in a godly marriage in order to serve the other person, in order to make them happy. And the same is true with wealth. We think that we have wealth in order to make ourselves happy. But actually, in the Bible, people were given wealth and then they were held accountable for how they treated other people, what they used their wealth for. Were they generous? Did they use it to improve the community, to improve especially those who were suffering as widows and orphans and beggars, people who were disabled? Or did they just use it for themselves? And this is all a lead up to our Old Testament reading from Amos. Amos is one of the first of the writing prophets. We know about Elijah and Elisha. We have their stories, but not books that they wrote. But Amos, we have this book that he wrote. He was in a unique situation. He lived when the kingdom of Israel had broken into two kingdoms, really. Israel proper, which was the northern kingdom, which was 10 tribes, and then Judah, which was the tribe of Judah and Benjamin in the south. And Amos lived in the south. He was from Judah, and he wasn't a professional. He was actually a shepherd and a dresser of fig trees, but he was called by God to go north to Bethel, where the northern kingdom, because they didn't have access to Jerusalem after they split off, they created their own sanctuary at Bethel. And he was called to go there and to confront the kings and the priests of Israel. Imagine being sent to a foreign country. You're just an agricultural worker, but you're sent to a foreign country to go into their top temple and confront the kings and the priests of that faith. And this was the call of Amos. And his call on behalf of the Lord was this. He told them that they needed to seek the Lord and live, because the Lord didn't want to bring destruction on them. But they were definitely going to suffer the consequences, especially of their corruption with regard to the poor. And you hear this a lot in Amos, in this passage that we have for this morning. You turn justice into bitterness and righteousness the ground. You hate the one who reproves in court and despise the one who tells the truth. And as a result, you build these stone mansions. You're not going to live in them. You have vineyards. You're not going to drink their wine, because God knows the many offenses and sins that we commit. Other people might not know that, especially if we have a good PR company, but God does. And he says, you repress the righteous, take bribes, and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. We have to apply this to ourselves, because as good as our court system is in the United States, it is nonetheless true that the more money you have, the better attorneys you can hire, the better chance you have of getting off in court. That's just simply a fact of life in our country, as it was in ancient times. I know we don't like to believe that, but you can objectively prove that this is the case. Nonetheless, in spite of this injustice, God doesn't want to destroy us. He wants to have us reform ourselves. He says, seek good, not evil, that you may live. Then the Lord will be with you as you say he is. The Israelites, of course, said that God was with them. They were the chosen nation. Many people in our country call it a Christian nation. Well, if we're going to call it a Christian nation, then we need to do everything we can to seek justice and righteousness, to seek that so that God will be with us. So that's our Old Testament reading. Our psalm for the day is one that also encourages wisdom, a little bit different. This is, interestingly enough, ascribed to Moses, Psalm 90, and we just get a piece of it, but it's kind of a famous line. It's, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. What does that mean, number our days? Well, we don't know exactly how many days we're going to live, and that's the point, right? That we want to recognize that even though we're planning for retirement and we have this plan worked through a financial advisor, that we don't actually know how many days we have. So to number them aright means that we plan both for an extended future and to die today, and we literally make the days count by doing what we can every day to serve God. This was written in the context of Israel suffering, I think, and because it says, "Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many days as we've seen trouble." We can all, I think, identify with that, and then show your deeds to your servants, your splendor to their children. God had shown His deeds to the Israelites when He freed them, parted the Red Sea, brought them into the Promised Land, and so on. But we want to continue to see His deeds so that our children also believe in Him. And then this interesting line in verse 17, may the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us, establish the work of our hands. What does that mean, that He establishes the work of our hands? My sense is that the things that we do are made firm by God. That is, we're doing things that are lasting and meaningful and wise. We're not just doing whatever we feel like. We're doing what we know God will bless, not only for us, but for others, including our children. So that's our responsive psalm. Our epistle reading for the day is taken from Hebrews. We're actually doing a little bit of a series of reading through Hebrews. This one says, see to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. So far, so good. But encourage each other daily. We have to ask, what are we to encourage each other to? That none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Oh, because sin is deceitful. We think that it's just a little thing, but it shapes our character. We think that it's not going to have consequences, but it does, whether we see them or not. And we need to keep reminding each other of this, of the consequences of our sin. And then the author of Hebrews goes to these children of Israel, these people, the Israelites, who were left in the desert. They rebelled against God and against Moses. They hardened their hearts, and God was angry with them for 40 years, it says. That doesn't mean just emotionally angry for 40 years. But what He did was, as a consequence of their unbelief, He had them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. We say wander as if they were lost. It only took about 3 months to get to the borders of the Promised Land, and they were there in 3 months, but they didn't trust God. So what He had them do was move from place to place for 40 years so that an entire generation of people who doubted the Lord would die off. And those that were left were people who had learned to trust in the Lord, to rely on Him. They had had the law of God, His instruction, for 40 years, and they were both spiritually and physically sturdier people. And then they were prepared to go in and take the Promised Land. So that's our epistle reading, and our gospel reading then, which is most strongly connected to Amos, is the story of a man who comes to Jesus. He's wealthy. Notice that he's also in earnest. He falls at Jesus' feet on his knees and ran up to Him, and he's earnest. He says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just point out that what do you do to inherit from somebody? Well, you can't do anything. If it's an inheritance, it's a gift. And so, he was kind of halfway true, but he was wrong that you can do something to inherit it other than trust in and follow Jesus. Trust God is again and again the resounding message of Scripture. But Jesus, stops him first and says, "Well, what do you mean by good? Who are you calling good? Do you mean good like God, which is perfect? Do you believe I'm God? Or do you just mean relatively good?" But he goes on. He doesn't, he kind of lets that slide. And he meets the guy where he's at. He says, "Well, you know the commandments." And the guy says, "I've done these all since I was a child," which was what the rabbis taught, that once you reach the age of accountability at a certain age, then you were liable for obeying the commandments. But of course, he could only obey them legalistically, not the way that Jesus intends, that it be completely, perfectly, and spiritually in your thoughts and words and actions obeyed. But Jesus lets this slide too, and he points out the man's spiritual condition by asking, he says, there's only one thing that you need yet. Sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. So the issue wasn't a particular commandment. The issue was, what did he worship? Was he just trying to add the worship of the true God to his current focus on wealth? Was this just he was looking for a fire insurance policy? Or did he actually want to spend eternity with God? Because if he wanted to spend eternity with God, if God is his focus, as his object of worship, his top priority, then you know, he could let go of these things. Jesus actually tells a parable of a pearl found in a marketplace, that a man sells everything he has to possess this one pearl. And that one pearl is this relationship with God through Jesus, that through which we have the gift of eternity, this inheritance that comes to us. But this man goes away sad because he couldn't give up all the other gifts that God had given him for the sake of the most valuable gift. And Jesus, I dare say, is sad too, because Jesus, we're told, loved him. He loved the man's zeal. He loved that he was pursuing this, but would have been sad that the man couldn't give up the less valuable things for the most valuable thing. So that's what I'm going to be preaching on. I hope that these passages stimulate some great discussion. The Lord bless you this week.